we went through that stage in Apple where we went out and we thought, oh, we're going to be a big company, let's hire professional management. We went out and hired a bunch of professional management. It didn't work at all. Most of them were bozos. They knew how to manage, but they didn't know how to do anything. And so if you're a great person, why do you want to work for somebody you can't learn anything from? And you know what's interesting? You know who the best managers are? They're the great individual contributors who never, ever want to be a manager, but decide they have to be a manager because no one else is going to be able to do as good a job as them.
You know, I think all of us need to be on guard against arrogance, which knocks at the door whenever you're successful.
Have you lived through that?
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. Well, as you may know, I was basically fired from Apple when I was 30, and was invited to come back 12 years later. So that was difficult when it happened. You know, you move on, life goes on, and you learn from it.
You were fired from Apple when you were 30, asked to come back when you were, what, 42?
Mm-hmm. Did
you think at that moment how sweet it is?
No, I thought at that moment, what a circle of life. You know, life is just always mysterious and surprising, and you never know what's around the next corner. So,
well, as a person, what's your biggest strength?
I've been very lucky in meeting incredibly talented people, and hanging out with them, and so that's been my greatest strength. Great things in business are never done by one person. They're done by a team of people. It's really always a team.
The world knows about two Steve Jobses. Mm-hmm. Steve Jobs, one was ruthless, a lot of people, did a lot of nasty things. But he was good to some people that were important to him, good engineers and whatever. He was actually good and never did something like that directly to me. And then he went away and he came back, Steve Jobs 2, and he was a little more refined. And I don't even know if that's true, because there were still some things going on that were very Jobs-ish. Just somebody walks in an elevator and just what they're wearing, you're fired. What human being, what decent human being could ever do something that way? You know, I would never bring up a kid to be that way or encourage anyone else to be that kind of a person. I knew Steve Jobs zero for 5 years before Apple. We were friends. He'd come into town every so often, see my latest invention, and turn it into money for both of us. So that was, we had a good relationship. Steve was not like a good student in academics, and genius, though, was believing in himself, largely, believing that he had ways of thinking that could be made into reality, and a lot of times his limitations of knowledge of what computers were led us to the world that we have to this day. And that was it's a type of genius. It's hard to say, but once he got in control, he had ways of making sure every little detail of a product was right. He showed the Macintosh to Bill Gates, but he didn't show the iPhone to Bill Gates. And he made every little detail was right. Every time Steve came up with an idea in the company, change things just slightly, change a color. In the end, I always sat there and said, he's actually right. It's a tiny, tiny bit, unseen by most people, but it's a tiny bit better the way Steve does it, so he's the smartest man in the room. As far as being a tyrant, it wasn't so much that he was a tyrant, it was things that you never see on YouTube. It was how he dealt with other people nastily ways, and just, fire somebody for no reason and do things that you'd say, how could a human being ever do that? Why does he doesn't have to be that way. A lot of us that were close to him saw those things. Some of them were portrayed in this movie, a little tiny bit of it. But there was an awful lot of that, and I would never raise a kid to be that way. I don't know how it happened. Steve always respected good engineers in the company, people that had ideas, that created things that really did good work for them, and he treated me the same way. He treats you with respect if you're in a certain category. Plus, like I said, I was always nice to him. I never said anything bad or nasty to him. There were, a couple incidences where he did things, but not me.
When he left to form Next, he asked me to come with him.
He wanted you to go.
He said, you got to come with me.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm in the middle of this hypercard thing. I think it's going to be important. I want to follow through and do it. He said, well, you could do it at Next. I said, well, Apple will distribute it to millions of people. They are my publisher. And I love you, Steve, but I can't. I want to do this. And he said, well, if you were really my friend, you'd come with me. Oh, that backed me into a corner. If you were really my friend, you'd want me to be fulfilled and successful at what I'm doing, and you would be rooting for me, and you would be advising me, you should stay with Apple because they can get this out to many more people than we can.
Did you say that to him?
I did. And so we had a period of about a year that we didn't really talk to each other that much. We had been really good friends before then. There was a period of, maybe 2.5 years where we ate more dinners together than not.
Yeah.
And if you'd asked either of us who the best friend was, it'd be the other. It's true, at the beginning, he was very polarized. It was gods and but that's just the beginning.
He was a young guy.
He grew, and he learned how to work with his people, to develop them. I think working at Next did a lot to educate him, to bring him up into working with a team. Certainly having a family made a big difference. Everybody likes to just focus in on this very caricature of his first years.
Right.
Like, a character, they exaggerate. He didn't really look like that, but if he had a big nose, well, they make it even bigger.
Right.
That's what they did, and I think it's a really disservice to what actually happened. And it's a disservice, certainly to Steve's family, because they know what he was really like.
Yeah.
So my favorite Steve Jobs story is one day, I'm in my cubicle, Steve shows up with someone I never met before, and he asked me, Guy, what do you think of this company called Nowhere? And I said, well, Steve, it's kind of a mediocre company, mediocre product, doesn't take advantage of graphics, not color, just kind of basic mediocrity, nothing that's strategic for us. And he says to me, I want you to meet the CEO of Nowhere. So that's what it was like working for Steve Jobs. You always have to be on the ball. My story.
Hi, my name is Randy Adams. I came to California in 1985 where I sold a company doing desktop publishing products, and it did quite well. And some of my friends who worked with me there went to work at Next, and they told Steve Jobs that he should hire me. So I went in for an interview, and I spent some time talking to Steve and the other engineers there. And I went back to my apartment in San Francisco, and I was getting pretty big royalty checks, and I really didn't want to work, so I turned down the job offer. And about 2 days later, my phone rang, and I didn't answer it, but on my message machine was a message from Steve, and he said, Randy, you're blowing it. This is an opportunity of a lifetime, and you have an opportunity to work at Next, and you're blowing it. And I thought, okay, Steve Jobs called me up and told me I'm blowing it. I better take a job at Next. So I went to work at Next. It was the fall of 1986, and Bill Gates came to visit Steve Jobs. I think Steve wanted to give him a demo of the Next machine. And he came, there was a 2-story building. Steve's office was in the upstairs, and he was in a cube. And I saw him sitting there doing nothing, and Bill arrived and sat downstairs, and Steve made him sit there for an hour before he'd take the meeting, and Steve wasn't busy at all. And he would do that a lot. And we thought as engineers, what better opportunity to sit down and talk to Bill Gates for an hour? So we all went down and sat on the couch with him and talked to him. It was amazing. I know a lot of celebrities. I've met a lot of very powerful people in my life. And I have to say, of all the people I've met, there was nobody, clearly nobody like Steve. When you were next to him and he was talking to you, you could feel the electricity in your body. You could feel his charisma. And it wasn't just because he was a cult leader or anything. You just actually could feel it, because I'm not necessarily a cult follower. And he made you feel, he could inspire you. He made you feel like you could do anything. And as long as you believed that, you really could do anything, as long as you're willing to sacrifice everything else. And I took my time with him, and I learned this from him. I became a follower of Steve, and I felt like I could do anything. And I've started 6 or 7 companies after that, and been very successful.
People revered him more than anybody as a...
Oh, I revere him, as you know. He was a one in a century plus kind of person, I think, and in most every way. And he was also demanding, and he was passionate about his point, and he believed that you get a better answer by debating. And so a lot of what people might not understand about him was he would debate just to get the subject going, sometimes taking a position that he didn't even believe. And just to get the discussion going, because he was so convinced, if you examine this thing from outside and in a deep kind of way, in a very thoughtful kind of way, you would arrive at a better decision. And I think, yes, I think that's something that not just founders, but everyone can learn from. And it's certainly from my point of view, it changed the trajectory of my life. And I can't imagine learning from anyone else the amount that I learned from him.
I did ask Steve to begin with. I said, so what happens, or how do you work if somebody doesn't agree with you? And he said, well, I just explain it to them until they understand. So I go back to my colleagues and explain this, and they all have this nervous laugh. The thing you should understand is, in all the 26 years with Steve and I never had one of these loud verbal arguments. I mean, it's not in my nature to do that. So I never actually had an argument with Steve, but we did disagree fairly frequently about things. And the way it worked was, I discovered, was that I would say something to him, and he would immediately shoot it down because he could think faster than I could. So, we end the conversation, and I would then wait a week, and usually this is on the telephone. I'd call him up, and I'd give my counter argument to what he had said, and he'd immediately shoot it down. So I'd wait another week. Sometimes this went on for months. But in the end, one of three things happened. About a third of the time, he said, oh, I get it, you're right. And that was the end of it. And there was another third of the time in which he'd say, actually, I think he is right. The other third of the time where we didn't reach consensus, he just let me do it my way. Never said anything more about it.
What was it like working with Steve Jobs? What aspect of his behavior and personality, let's say, brought out the best in you?
Pushing you, really pushing you, relentless on the details, challenging you for the right reasons. It wasn't bullying. It wasn't demeaning. He would critique the work, not judge the person, at least not in front of them, or inside of in front of a group or anything like that. No, it was really that attention to detail. And when he would make a decision, when you make the first version of anything, something revolutionary, there are a lot of opinion-based decisions. And there's only one or two people, three people who hold those opinion-based decisions and what they should be. And when you have those opinions and you're trying to work with the team to implement those decisions, you have to really tell the why of those decisions. Just don't go do it, but why it's there. So you can feel part of that decision. You can understand what were the trade-offs of the different other answers to that opinion, right? And say, this is the reason why we picked what we picked, because it's this for the customer or this for the overall story, what have you, so that you felt really good. Because a lot of times most people want a data-driven decision. But with V1s, you don't get data. People who work with those types of people who are unrelenting and push you and might make you upset, a lot of times it's a knee-jerk reaction to go, they are an asshole. Get off my back. You're an ass. Blah, 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 blah. Right? And you're protecting your ego. Because what's happening is that person is usually pushing you beyond your boundaries. They see something that we can do or you can do that you're just either not wanting to do for whatever reason. You're not confident in that. You're like, I don't want to take the extra time, and saying, no, we need to get that done, and pushing you. Okay. And so when we came to those areas, it wasn't just a one-on-one, it could be Steve against the team going, we need glass instead of plastic on the front face of the iPhone. And we're going to do this. And we're like, God, and so we did it. And he pushed us because he didn't know all the details, but he could see in our minds that we're like, we could probably, but man, it's really putting us in risk. And we laid out the risks for him. And he's like, I'm willing to take those risks. We'll do that. We're like, We might be 3 months late. He's like, this is so important. We need to stay on time. You know, but it would be all the time, push, push, push. He was never unchallengeable. You could challenge him. Now the plastic to glass story is a perfect example of this.
Yeah.
So at the beginning of the project, well before we were going, we had always had these things about, you know, plastic front iPods, these kinds of things, you know, scratches and all that other stuff. So we said, oh, we're going to have a glass or a plastic display, a cover for the display, because the display was glass underneath it. We argued back and forth about glass versus plastic, and then we all landed together on plastic. Okay? The original decision was plastic.
Mm-hmm.
And the reasons were, okay, we don't want to make a mistake. Glass can break. You know, people drop them all the time. So we don't want to have a fragile device because you're going to be using even more than a music player, right? And you're going to be holding your head and putting it in your pocket and misses and all that stuff. So we went down the road with plastic. When it was shown, when the product was shown at Mac World in 2007, the first time, that was plastic. We had just enough of them in the field at the time. We started seeing light scratches on the plastic. Reviewers who didn't have the device yet, because it was behind glass. If you remember 2007, the Jesus phone comes up and no one could even touch them. You could just look at it in this beautiful museum quality box, like it came from the future or whatever, the past. And it was like, oh, and you just looked and that was all you got. But then people said, well, what covers on that? You know, reviewers who knew better, you know, and they're like, it's plastic. And they were like, really? And so there was enough of a doubt there. And then when we started to do it, and then Steve changed the frame of reference of the question or of the result of what the customer would think. And he was like, if we designed it with plastic and it's in their pocket all the time and it gets scratched by coins, lightly scratched, or by keys or something like that, that is a design problem. We need to fix that was our bad. If they go off and drop it, or even slightly drop it, and it cracks, it's the customer's fault. And they have less likelihood to complain. Yes, they'll complain, but they're part of that failure.
Yes. Oh, that's fascinating.
And then
there's truth to that.
Right?
Yeah.
Because then they were part of why it failed. Whereas the design, they didn't do anything wrong. It was just sitting in their pocket and it's scratching. And that's normal use. Yeah. Abnormal use is been dropped. And we're like, oh, now we get it. And so we all moved to that mindset when you framed the problem and the solution in that way versus the original framing where we all landed on plastic. So, and then he was unrelenting on that, but we all had moved. And we had moved mindset and we understood the why and we marshaled together. And then by the end of June, and it was crazy, the mechanical product design teams, sourcing, all of us, the partner, Corning, pulled together to make that happen because it was the right reason, right? So this, you know, you look at these stories and you hear just the top line rumors of the takeaways, but that's not usually how it all happened of like one leader was, that's not how Steve was. Now I've seen leaders who are just pounding, you know, and just had no real empathy for the team and understanding the why. And it is the way I want it, right? I am the supreme leader. That wasn't like that. When
he just had a very strong opinion.
A very strong opinion.
But it was challengeable.
It was challengeable. And if you came with the right thing, you know, you could modulate that. But you had to come with a team. It couldn't just be you. It had to come a team and data and to overcome, because it was a very strong opinion.
I got to ask this. What was it like working with Steve Jobs?
I didn't work with him.
Did you interact with him?
Twice. I said hi to him twice in the cafeteria.
What did he say? Hi?
He said, hey, fellas. He was friendly. He was wandering around and with somebody, he couldn't find the table because the cafeteria was packed, and I gave him my table. But I worked for Mike Colbert, who talked to Like Mike was the unofficial CTO of Apple and a brilliant guy. And he worked for Steve for 25 years, maybe more. And he talked to Steve multiple times a day. And he was one of the people that could put up with Steve's, let's say, brilliance and intensity. And Steve really liked him. And Steve trusted Mike to translate the shit he thought up into engineering products that work. And then Mike ran a group called Platform Architecture, and I was in that group. So many times I'd be sitting with Mike and the phone would ring. It'd be Steve, and Mike would hold the phone like this because Steve would be yelling about something or other.
Yeah. And then he would translate.
And he'd translate, and then he would say, Steve wants us to do this. So.
Was Steve a good engineer or no?
I don't know. He was a great idea guy.
Idea person.
And he's a really good selector for talent.
Yeah. So that seems to be one of the key elements of leadership, right?
And then he was a really good first principles guy. Like somebody say something couldn't be done, and he would just think, that's obviously wrong. Right? But, maybe it's hard to do. Maybe it's expensive to do. Maybe we need different people. There's like a whole bunch of, if you want to do something hard, maybe it takes time. Maybe you have to iterate. There's a whole bunch of things you could think about. But saying it can't be done is stupid. He had computer people talk to him all the time. Like Mike was a really good computer guy. He knew what computers could do.
Computer meaning computer hardware, like low-level
hardware,
stuff?
software, all the pieces.
The whole thing.
And then he would, have an idea about what could we do with this next. That was grounded in reality. It wasn't like he was, just finger painting on the wall and wishing somebody would interpret it. So he had this interesting connection because, he wasn't a computer architect or designer, but he had an intuition from the computers we had to what could happen. And
it's interesting you say intuition because it seems like he was pissing off a lot of engineers in his intuition about what can and can't be done. What is all these stories about like floppy disks and all that kind of stuff like
that? So in Steve, the first round, he'd go into a lab and look at what's going on and hate it and fire people or ask somebody in the elevator what they're doing for Apple and, not be happy. When he came back, my impression is he surrounded himself with a relatively small group of people.
Yes.
And didn't really interact outside of that as much. And then the joke was you'd see somebody moving a prototype through the quad with a black blanket over it. And that was because it was secret, partly from Steve because they didn't want Steve to see it until it was ready.